Today, I'm taking you on a trip back to an America that smelled like nutmeg, orange peel, and slow simmered molasses. An America where fruitcakes weren't a joke gift or a holiday afterthought, but a badge of pride that families guarded with handwritten cards and secret steps no one dared change. Before grocery aisles offered instant mixes and neon colored candied fruit, Christmas fruitcake was a patient craft. It took planning, respect for ingredients, and a belief that the holiday season deserved something that felt earned. Across the country, kitchens came alive every December. You'd hear chopping boards knocking against counters, pans clattering, and the slow scrape of spoons working their way through heavy batter. Families soaked dried fruit weeks in advance, saved up sugar the way some people saved coins, and set aside their best tin just for the holiday loaf. Some recipes were born in England and carried across the ocean by immigrants who wanted at least one familiar taste in a strange new world. Others were shaped in farmhouses where ingredients were limited and creativity was the only luxury anyone could afford. No matter where it came from, fruitcake once held a place in American homes that was sentimental and steady. It marked the season. It reminded people of who taught them how to cook. It connected generations. But somewhere along the way, the country changed. Convenience replaced patience. Prepackaged fruitcake jokes replaced tradition. And many of the old versions, the real ones, were quietly forgotten. So let's open the door again. Let's dust off the old tins, revisit the flavors that told stories, and look at the Christmas fruitcakes America lost along the way. If you enjoy uncovering old traditions and forgotten recipes, make sure to like the video and subscribe. There's a lot of history waiting on the counter. Number 1. The colonial New England boiled Christmas cake. If you lived in early New England, the smell of a Christmas cake didn't come from an oven. It rose from a heavy iron pot simmering by the hearth, wrapped in cloth, bubbling for hours. Today it sounds strange, but this boiled Christmas cake was once the heart of a winter celebration that looked nothing like the one we know now. For the colonists, an oven was a luxury. Even families who had one rarely fired it up often. Wood was too valuable, and baking used up fuel fast. Boiling, on the other hand, was predictable and efficient. So when December arrived, families mixed flour, dried apples, currants, ginger, nutmeg, and whatever scraps of sweetness they could manage. Then they tied the batter inside a floured cloth, lowered it into a pot of boiling water, and let time do the work. What emerged was a firm, slightly spongy cake that carried the comfort of winter spices but held the humbleness of a frontier kitchen. It mattered because it belonged to a world still finding its footing. Sugar was expensive. Imported raisins came only on ships that traveled long, dangerous routes. Every ingredient had weight, and every bite represented work. When a boiled Christmas cake appeared on the table, it was more than dessert. It was proof that a family had endured another year, gathered enough to spare for a celebration, and held tight to traditions they brought with them from England. In a century where life was harsh, this simple pudding was a quiet victory. The emotional turn comes from what happened next. By the early 1800s, America was changing fast. More households owned brick ovens. Trade routes expanded. Spices became cheaper. Suddenly, the old boiled cake, once a symbol of survival, started to feel outdated. Families wanted baked Christmas cakes with glossy finishes and brighter fruit. What was once a beloved tradition slipped out of fashion almost overnight. Today, most Americans have never heard of a boiled Christmas cake at all, even though it shaped early holiday cooking for more than 100 years. Yet, if you taste one, you feel the past immediately. It's humble. It's heavy. It doesn't try to impress. Instead, it carries the warmth of a family sitting close to the fire while snow collects outside. It reminds you that Christmas wasn't always wrapped in abundance. Sometimes it was just a pot, a handful of ingredients, and the hope that next year would be a little easier. Number 2, the early American election cake turned Christmas treat. Before it ever reached the Christmas table, This cake had nothing to do with December at all. In the early days of the Republic, it belonged to Election Day. Hard to imagine now, but when towns gathered to vote, it was a rare moment of community, travel, and shared food. Women baked massive, spiced, fruit filled cakes to feed travelers who rode long miles to cast ballots. It wasn't a small loaf either. Some recipes from the late 1700s call for more than 20 pounds of flour. These cakes were closer to landmarks than desserts. The recipe had roots in English great cakes, but America shaped it into something new. Bakers loaded the batter with molasses, cider, dried fruit, and warming spices like allspice and ginger. Then they let it rise using cider barm or early yeast. When you picture a young country trying to define itself, this cake fit right in. It was bold, generous, and designed for a crowd. The shift toward Christmas came quietly. As Election Day changed and travel became easier, the original purpose faded. But families didn't want to let go of a recipe tied to community and memory. By the mid-1800s, pieces of the old election cake started appearing during winter gatherings. Home cooks scaled it down, added richer ingredients, and leaned into the holiday flavors that were rising in popularity. Citrus peel, raisins, and brandy made their way into the batter. Before long, some households treated it as their Christmas fruitcake without even knowing its political past. It was a recipe that carried a story without needing to tell it. Its importance came from the way it reflected early American life. The country was still new. People traveled by horseback or wagon, and a big cake wasn't just food. It was a sign of hospitality. You fed strangers because they were part of something bigger. When the cake found its second life at Christmas, it carried that same spirit. Families who sliced into it weren't only sharing dessert. They were holding on to the idea that gatherings mattered, that food brought people together in a way laws and debates never could. The emotional turn shows up in what followed. As baking powders appeared and lighter cakes took over American kitchens, the old election cake felt clumsy and outdated. Generations who had never voted on horseback didn't see the meaning anymore. By the 20th century, it faded into the same dusty corner as many early American recipes. A few historical societies keep it alive, but most holiday bakers have no idea that one of the country's earliest political traditions once became their grandparents' Christmas treat. Still, when you look back at it, you can almost picture where it came from. A cold morning, a crowded tavern, riders warming their hands while the smell of spiced cake drifts from a wooden table. Number 3, the 1800s molasses fruit brick. If you walked into an American kitchen in the mid-1800s, you wouldn't find white sugar piled in neat ceramic jars. You'd find a dark, sticky jug of molasses sitting near the stove, ready to sweeten almost everything. Sugar was expensive, molasses was cheap. That difference shaped entire generations of holiday recipes, including a Christmas fruit cake so dense and dark that families jokingly called it the brick. This wasn't an insult. It was simply the reality of cooking in a country where refined ingredients were still a luxury. Bakers stirred molasses into their batter until the mixture turned nearly black. They folded in raisins, dried apples, and sometimes little chunks of candied orange peel if they were lucky enough to have them. The spices were equally bold: cloves, allspice, cinnamon, and sometimes a pinch of black pepper. When the cake went into the oven, the molasses caramelized and created a flavor that was deep, smoky, and unforgettable. It mattered because it reflected the real American pantry of the time. Molasses was tied to trade routes, farms, and the daily grind of working families. It was the sweetener of sailors, merchants, and small towns. For many households, a molasses fruit cake was the only Christmas cake they could afford. It didn't look elegant, but it held the warmth of winter and the promise of celebration. In homes where money was tight, this cake was a small triumph. Families sliced it thin, warmed it by the fire, and treated it like treasure. Then came the emotional twist. As the 19th century closed and the new century arrived, refined sugar dropped in price. Supermarkets appeared. Brightly colored candied fruits became common. Suddenly, the old molasses cake felt old-fashioned. Its dark color seemed heavy compared to the lighter, sweeter fruit cakes taking over Christmas tables. Within a generation, the recipe slipped into obscurity. The same flavor that once represented comfort now seemed outdated, even embarrassing. If you taste it today, the memory comes rushing back. It's rugged. It's bold. It doesn't try to charm you. Instead, it speaks to the simplicity of a kitchen lit by oil lamps, where holiday baking depended on what you had, not what looked pretty. It reminds you that Christmas wasn't always coated in bright red cherries and sugary icing. Sometimes it was a dark loaf wrapped in cloth, cooling on a windowsill while snow gathered outside. And from this heavy, molasses-rich tradition, the story carries us westward, where fruitcakes took on a very different purpose. Number 4, the Frontier Whiskey-Soaked Trail Cake. On the frontier, Christmas didn't come with carols, ribbons, or a glowing kitchen. It arrived in the middle of long winters, rough cabins, and nights spent beside a dying fire. Out there, a fruitcake wasn't a holiday luxury. It was a tool. A frontier family or a wandering miner didn't bake a cake for the season. They baked a cake that could survive the season. The whiskey-soaked trail cake started out as a practical solution. Fresh ingredients spoiled fast, especially for people pushing west across the Rockies or digging for gold in California. Dried fruit lasted longer. Flour traveled well. Whiskey was easy to find in nearly every mining town. When these ingredients came together, the result was a hearty, tightly packed cake built to endure cold, travel, and time. Bakers poured whiskey over it not for flavor alone, but for preservation. The alcohol kept the cake moist and safe to eat for weeks, sometimes months. Its importance on the frontier can't be overstated. For many people living far from towns, this cake was one of the few holiday foods they could rely on. Long before glossy, candied fruit became standard, miners folded dried cherries, apricots, currants, and even crushed nuts into the mixture. When Christmas rolled around, a slice of this cake meant more than sweetness. It meant connection, memory, and the reminder of a world beyond the rugged hills. Men who spent their days digging through frozen ground would share pieces around a fire, telling stories of home. The cake became a moment of normalcy in an environment where normal life was slipping further away each month. Then came the emotional turn. As the frontier era faded and cities grew, the trail cake felt like a relic. New cookbooks pushed lighter holiday desserts. Families wanted airy breads and bright toppings, not dense loaves soaked in alcohol. By the mid-20th century, the whiskey-soaked fruitcake was something people joked about rather than honored. A food built for endurance didn't fit into a world that now had refrigerators, supermarkets, and holiday abundance. The practicality that once made the cake essential now made it obsolete. Still, when you revisit it, you feel the weight of its past. The flavor is strong and warm. The texture tells you it was made to last. One bite brings to mind the image of a miner unwrapping his precious cake after a long day, or a family in a log cabin cutting thin slices to make it last through winter. It's a reminder that Christmas on the frontier was about survival and the comfort of traditions carried far from home. Number 5, the Victorian ribbon fruit cake. If you stepped into a well-to-do American home in the late 1800s, the Christmas fruitcake didn't look rugged or practical anymore. It looked refined. The Victorian era brought a sense of display into the kitchen, and nothing embodied that more than the ribbon fruitcake. This was a dessert built not only to taste good, but to impress. Every slice was meant to reveal neat, colorful stripes of fruit and batter that looked almost like fabric, hence the name ribbon. Victorian cooks loved order and structure. They sifted flour twice, trimmed fruit into perfect cubes, and worked butter until it felt like soft velvet. The ribbon cake followed that mindset. It was layered carefully. One thin sheet of plain batter, then a line of candied fruit, then another thin sheet of batter, and so on, until the tin was filled. When baked and sliced, the cake showed clean bands of color, like a Christmas ornament in edible form. It was the opposite of the rustic loaves that came before it. This was a cake for parlors, not cabins. It mattered because it reflected a new chapter in American life. Industrialization brought wealth. Cities grew. Families had access to new ingredients, imported citrus, factory-made sugar, and even early kitchen tools. Holiday baking shifted from pure necessity to a form of pride. A beautiful ribbon cake signaled that a household had time, resources, and skill. Women shared their versions at Christmas teas and church socials, comparing layers the way families today compare decorations. For many, it represented the height of holiday elegance. But the emotional twist came with how fragile the tradition was. As the 20th century moved in, tastes changed again. People wanted faster recipes. Layering took patience, and most families no longer had servants or all-day baking schedules. Cheaper, mass-produced candied fruit also changed the look of the cake, making the once delicate stripes appear artificial. By the 1950s, the ribbon fruit cake faded behind newer trends: gelatin molds, refrigerator cakes, and packaged mixes. A dessert that once symbolized refinement became one more forgotten relic of a slower, careful era. If you slice one today, the nostalgia comes back immediately. The colors look gentle rather than loud. The texture is soft, not dense. It carries the feel of a Victorian parlor decorated with holly, with a fire burning low and a piano playing in the background. You can almost picture the pride on a baker's face as the first perfect slice is revealed. And as this elegant chapter closes, the story moves toward a very different Christmas tradition, one shaped by simplicity, discipline, and a community known for turning modest ingredients into something quietly beautiful. Number 6, the Shaker Simple Fruit Loaf. When most Americans picture Christmas fruitcake, they think of richness, abundance, and sweet ingredients piled together. The Shakers saw it differently. Their version of a holiday fruit loaf came from a community that valued order, humility, and honest workmanship. It wasn't flashy or heavily spiced. It was calm. It was balanced. And in its own quiet way, it was beautiful. The Shakers lived in tightly knit villages across New England and the Midwest. Everything they made carried their beliefs: simplicity, precision, and purpose. Their Christmas fruit loaf followed the same rules. Instead of bright candied fruit, they used dried apples, currants, or raisins, whatever the community had preserved during the summer. They chopped everything to the same size, mixed it into a clean, lightly sweet batter, and baked it until the crumb was even and soft. The key wasn't excess, it was harmony. Every ingredient had a job. Nothing overwhelmed anything else. This cake mattered because it reflected the way the Shakers approached life. They didn't bake to impress visitors or compete with neighbors. They baked to nourish their community. Their fruit loaf tasted modest, but it carried the comfort of a place where everything was done with careful intention. At a time when other American households were moving toward richer Christmas desserts, the Shaker cake remained steady and dependable. Families who visited Shaker villages often brought the recipe home because it felt different from anything they had tasted: cleaner, gentler, almost peaceful. The emotional twist comes from how quickly the tradition disappeared. As the 20th century approached, Shaker communities grew smaller. Their way of life, built on shared labor and celibacy, was impossible to sustain as the world changed around them. Without new generations to carry the recipes forward, many dishes simply faded out of daily use. The fruit loaf didn't compete with modern holiday baking either. People wanted bold flavors, colorful decorations, and ingredients that signaled celebration. A quiet cake didn't stand a chance. But if you make it today, you feel something that's hard to describe. The flavor isn't loud, it settles slowly. The texture is soft and comforting, the kind of cake you eat warm with a simple cup of tea. It feels like stepping into an old meeting house with polished wooden floors and sunlight coming through tall windows. For a moment, you understand how a community could find joy in restraint. And from this gentle tradition, the story moves deeper into America's immigrant kitchens. The next forgotten cake wasn't quiet at all. Number 7, the Pennsylvania Dutch Schnitz Unknep Christmas Cake. If Christmas had a flavor in Pennsylvania's farm country, it was apple. Not the crisp, fresh kind you find in today's markets, but dried apple slices, schnitz, packed away after the harvest and stored for the long winter ahead. The Pennsylvania Dutch used those apples in everything, now including a forgotten Christmas fruit cake that blended orchard life, immigrant memory, and the rhythm of a working farm. This cake didn't start in a bakery. It started in the fall when families peeled, sliced, and strung apples on long threads to dry in the warm air of late September. Those apples became the backbone of winter cooking. When Christmas approached, home cooks softened the schnitz in warm cider and folded them into a thick batter along with raisins, nuts, and fragrant spices. The result was a dense, comforting cake with a deep apple sweetness that felt rooted in the land itself. Its importance came from the world that created it. The Pennsylvania Dutch weren't interested in fancy imported ingredients. They relied on what they grew, what they preserved, and what could survive a freezing January. Their Christmas cake reflected that mindset. It tasted familiar. It tasted like home. Generations of families served it at the holiday table, often alongside bowls of warm cream or cider sauce. In a community built around farming, faith, and tradition, this cake was a reminder of continuity, of the land providing year after year. Then came the emotional turn. As the 20th century pulled rural America toward modernization, the old patterns shifted. Few families dried their own apples anymore. Store-bought fruit became the norm. Cookbooks stopped printing old-fashioned recipes that required days of preparation. The schnitz cake, tied so closely to a way of life that depended on seasonal work, simply didn't fit the new pace. Slowly, it slipped out of holiday celebrations. Even among descendants of the Pennsylvania Dutch, it became something grandparents remembered but no one baked. Tasting it today feels like rediscovering a world that moved at a steadier pace. The apple flavor is rich and warm, mixing with cinnamon and nutmeg in a way that feels both familiar and distinct. The texture is slightly chewy from the dried fruit, and every bite carries the sense of a farmhouse kitchen with snow gathering on the porch and lantern light flickering against wooden walls. From this orchard-centered tradition, the story shifts south into warmer air, different crops, and a fruit cake shaped not by apples but by figs and pecans. Number 8, the Southern Fig and Pecan Holiday Cake. In the American South, Christmas fruit cake didn't always come from jars of bright candied cherries or imported raisins. For many families, those ingredients were expensive luxuries that didn't fit the realities of rural life. Instead, they turned to what the land offered: figs from backyard trees and pecans gathered from orchards or the ground beneath towering native trees. The result was a Christmas cake that tasted unmistakably Southern, earthy, sweet, and shaped by the rhythm of the seasons. Figs were everywhere in the South. People dried them in the sun, boiled them into preserves, or stored them for winter baking. Pecan trees grew wild along fence lines and riverbanks, and families spent afternoons cracking shells by hand, saving the best pieces for Christmas. When the holiday approached, home cooks chopped the figs into soft, sticky bits and folded them into a rich batter with brown sugar and warm spices. The chopped pecans added crunch and a buttery flavor that gave the cake its character. It wasn't flashy. It was grounded in the landscape. This cake mattered because it represented resourcefulness and regional identity. Long before supermarkets made exotic fruits accessible, Southern families baked with what they had. A fig and pecan fruit cake wasn't a compromise. It was a celebration of familiar flavors, flavors tied to childhood yards, family farms, and traditions passed quietly from one generation to the next. Many households preferred it to the traditional British-style fruitcakes. It was softer, less dense, and carried the sweetness of homegrown fruit rather than sugary candied pieces. In communities where money was often tight, this cake was both practical and deeply personal. The emotional twist came when the world around it changed. By the mid-20th century, store-bought candied fruit became a symbol of a proper Christmas cake. Advertisements pushed bright, commercialized versions that looked nothing like the humble Southern loaf. Over time, the fig and pecan cake was overshadowed, replaced by recipes that promised convenience and presentation. Younger generations stopped tending fig trees. Families bought nuts instead of gathering them. The old cake slipped out of cookbooks and holiday tables, remembered only by a few who still kept handwritten recipes in worn boxes. Yet when you taste it today, the past comes back in full color. The figs bring a honeyed sweetness that feels warm and comforting. The pecans add depth and texture. Together, they create a flavor that speaks of front porches at dusk, slow summer afternoons, and kitchens where Christmas baking was a community event. It feels like a story baked into a loaf. Number 9, the Caribbean-influenced black rum cake of coastal America. If you followed the old port towns along America's eastern coastline, Boston, Providence, Charleston, New Orleans, you'd find a Christmas fruit cake that looked nothing like the pale loaves served inland. This one was almost black, rich, glossy, heavy with molasses, burnt sugar, and rum. It didn't originate in the United States. It came from Caribbean kitchens, carried north by sailors, traders, dock workers, and immigrant families who brought their holiday traditions with them. The black rum cake was a masterpiece of patience. Bakers started by soaking dried fruit, raisins, currants, prunes, citron, in dark rum for weeks, sometimes months. Some families even kept a jar year-round, topping it up as fruit was used and replaced. When Christmas approached, they folded that boozy fruit into a dark batter sweetened with caramelized sugar syrup. The cake baked low and slow until its color deepened into a near-black hue. After cooling, it was brushed again with rum, allowing it to age into a dense, fragrant dessert that lasted for weeks. It mattered because it connected coastal America to a wider world. Port cities were cultural crossroads, places where spices arrived in barrels, sailors swapped stories on the docks, and immigrant communities built neighborhoods full of imported flavors. The black rum cake reflected that mixture. It carried the warmth of nutmeg and cinnamon from the Caribbean, the bitterness of burnt sugar from old Afro-Caribbean techniques, and the celebratory spirit tied to rum. In communities where families had crossed oceans to begin new lives, this cake tasted like home. It traveled to American Christmas tables not through fancy cookbooks, but through people and memory. The emotional twist came when immigration patterns shifted and culinary trends changed. By the mid-20th century, many port neighborhoods were redeveloped or displaced. Younger generations leaned toward lighter, quicker holiday desserts. The deep, rum-soaked loaf felt too heavy, too old-fashioned. Supermarkets pushed packaged fruit cakes instead, and the traditional black cake was pushed to the margins. Outside Caribbean American households, it nearly vanished from the coastal food landscape. Yet when you try one today, its story hits you instantly. The flavor is bold and layered. The rum brings warmth that settles slowly. The dark syrup gives it a smoky sweetness that feels both celebratory and serious. It tastes like a cake made for long nights, laughter, and gatherings that stretch past midnight. You can almost hear the sound of waves against a harbor wall, or the lively music drifting from old seaside streets as families prepared for Christmas. And from this rum-soaked coastal tradition, the story moves into a far leaner era, the Great Depression, where families couldn't rely on imported fruit at all. Number 10. The Great Depression mock fruitcake. When money dried up in the 1930s, the Christmas table had to bend without breaking. Families still wanted a holiday treat, but real fruitcake was far out of reach. So they created something clever, humble, and surprisingly tasty: the mock fruitcake. Instead of raisins, currants, or candied peel, cooks used whatever they had on hand. Some folded in chopped prunes or the syrup from canned fruit. Others relied on crushed crackers, day old bread, or leftover biscuits to bulk up the batter. A few recipes called for strong tea to give color and depth, which made the cake look richer than it was. People joked that it wasn't fruit cake at all. It was a promise of fruit cake. Sugar was scarce, so sweetness came from molasses or a bit of brown sugar, carefully measured by the spoonful. Spices were stretched the same way. If a family couldn't spare nutmeg or cloves, they used cinnamon alone. If they had no butter, they used lard. Every ingredient was about making something special out of almost nothing. Even with all these substitutions, the mock fruit cake mattered. It kept the ritual alive. When families cut that dense, fragrant loaf on Christmas Day, it reminded them that joy didn't depend on wealth. It depended on effort, creativity, and the simple act of keeping traditions alive during hard times. Many who grew up in those years never forgot the taste. It wasn't luxurious, but it carried something better: pride. A reminder that they made it through together with a little cake that pretended to be something grand and ended up being something meaningful instead. When you set all these lost fruit cakes side by side, something becomes clear. Each one carried more meaning than the ingredients written on the page. They were markers of time. They were reminders that holidays weren't about perfection, but about doing the best you could with what you had. Immigrant families used them to hold on to their roots. Rural families use them to stretch ingredients through long winters. City families use them to feel a little closer to one another when work kept everyone busy and days moved too fast. These cakes survived wars, shortages, economic crashes, and cultural shifts. They appeared on tables during years when money was thin and during years when the world finally felt steady again. They tasted like hope in hard seasons and celebration in easy ones. And even though many of them faded from memory, the stories they carried never really disappeared. They're still tucked into old recipe boxes, clipped in 1940s newspapers, or half remembered by someone who watched their grandmother press raisins into dough by hand. Looking back at them now reminds us of something simple. Food isn't just food. It's a record of how people lived, what they valued, and what they held on to, even when everything else was unstable. Fruitcake may not be the star of modern Christmas tables anymore, but the history behind it is still worth remembering.